the rights, didn't have to wait in line. I drove you to your house, where you stared up at the stars. I listened to your heartbeat as I held you in my arms. We hung out at the rainbow where we drank till that fast soon. Nothing could go wrong when it's time in love with you. The Christina hotel room and living out to that first kiss. Searching for a high school that you know doesn't exist. These are the things that make me free. I feel like I'm stuck in a stand by me. This night was too good to.
Announcement for you, and that is to remind you that all of you will have received an email about the first meeting of the Human Rights Club, which is tomorrow evening. So you have emails, if you haven't checked them, with the location, which I believe is in Charlie Brown's, and I know it's early evening. I hope many of you who signed up will be able to be there. We will be forwarding your email addresses, so from here on out, you should be hearing from them directly and how they've been operating. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Myrna Goodman. Dr. Goodman's training is in sociology. She holds a doctorate from the University of California, Davis. Her area of specialization was the resistance movement in Denmark. I hope you would join me in welcoming her and in giving her your full attention this afternoon. Thank you.
I am a prisoner of technology. Am I blocking anybody's view? No? Okay, good. Bless you. Ta-da. Okay. Just a quick informal kind of statement about the place where I study genocide. I had actually studied about the Holocaust from the time I was a small child. And my own interests are not only in resistance, but in rescuers. And I think you will see, as the lecture comes to its conclusion, that that has influenced me. My topic for today is the sociology of genocide. Up until this point, we have been talking about the historical factors that contributed to the Holocaust. We're going to use the Holocaust once again, but now we're going to start broadening out our perspective about genocide. And the reason I have said in my classes to you, the reason that we study the Holocaust, among other things, is because it is what we call the prototypical genocide. If it happened in the Holocaust, it usually has happened in another genocide. But one of the things that you're going to find out today, as we go through this, is that there's a lot of disagreement over what exactly constitutes a genocide, and that notices that we don't know about genocides until they're over. Oh, 1 million people were starved to death. That's a genocide. Not 1 million people are starving to death. And one of the things that we're trying to work towards is recognizing when genocide is, when mass killing and mass brutalization are leading up to genocide. So let's start, hopefully, the technology. So we'll do this for the people who want to stay here. If you're not used to me, you know that I always do that kind of thing. Okay, let's see if I can... So the outline today is, I first want to talk about some historical examples of genocide. We know from some of the videos that we've seen that genocide has happened in both the ancient and the more current past. And unfortunately, I want to talk about exposed to, if you remember in one of the videos we saw, but it's always nice to know because some of my students say to me, Well, I read about that before. Why did Professor Bittner repeat it? Well, things repeated often stick. I want to talk about the importance of Raphael Lemkin, who was a jurist, a lawyer, and then idea of the range things fall into. The Herreros in the colony in German Southwest Africa. The Armenians, we'll be studying more about that. The Ukrainians, the Soviets starved. Millions of Ukrainians took the wheat that they were growing away and never returned any of it to them, so they starved in the 30s. Obviously. And there have also been genocides in East Pakistan, in Cambodia, East Timor, Burundi. Of course, we all know about Rwanda, or hopefully we will learn about it, in Bosnia. Thank you. The first one I'll talk about is this is known as the Albigensian Crusades, the early. Another genocide was when approximately 285,000 Catholics were murdered between 1587 and 1610 in Japan. These were people who were Catholic missionaries, Jesuits, and also Japanese who had converted to Catholicism. And this is one of our first examples of genocide. The interesting thing that happened with this genocide was it ended around 1610. And for those of you who are either history majors or who have heard of this, once that genocide was over, Japan closed its doors to the West, and no one from the West could come to Japan until about the late 18th century, I believe. The next is Native Americans. Background included some very personal experiences when he was growing up in an area that is in between what's now the Ukraine and Poland, where he personally witnessed pogroms. And you remember pogroms were those militia-based attacks against Jews. So he was born in 1901 in eastern Poland, the son of a Jewish farmer. He had a very well-educated mother, and she made sure that he received a very, very good education, even though he had been born in a rural area. And he was broadly educated in Poland, in Germany, and France, and was quite a renowned scholar. When the Germans occupied Poland in 1939, he fled for fear of his life because he was very aware of the possibility that being a Jew was not good for his health. And he framed the concept of genocide in 1943. Okay. You wait for me to do this, okay? All right. So what are the origins of the suffix "cide" is Latin for killer or act of killing. So you can see how the two terms go together to create the word genocide. I got it. Okay. As you can understand, or maybe you can't, there was a lot of wrangling to get at some sort of definition, a legal definition, not to include acts of war between armies. This is about civilians. Yes? Could you speak up, Cassie? It would do what to the sovereign rights of states? Impose what upon them? the Soviets denied the Ukrainians food. They took the wheat that they had grown, that is known as the breadbasket of the, or was known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. After the harvest, they took all of the wheat back to the central part of the Soviet Union and sent none back, largely because, if you remember from our readings in Bergen about the Holocaust, the people in the Ukraine were enemies of the Soviet system. They did not want to be collectivized. That was a political genocide. The Soviets were members of the Security Council when this convention was drafted, and that's why politics is not in there, or political isn't. Okay, so we have some background about definitions of genocide and other people that the Nazis had categorized as enemies of the Aryan state. Sociology also seeks to investigate, analyze, and generalize about the social phenomena connected to genocide. What things are there about how we interact in groups that contribute to genocide? So I'm going to throw another definition at you. If you have your reader, you'll know that there are several definitions in there, some of which I'm going to use today. And this one is the research definition from two sociologists from Canada, who were the first to try and put facts together so that we have some way of understanding things in a more unified way. And they say this is the very first sociological definition of genocide. Genocide is a form of one-sided mass killing in which a state or other authority intends to destroy a group as that group and membership in it are defined. Genocide is a form of one-sided mass killing in which a state or other authority intends to destroy a group as that group and membership in it are defined by the perpetrators. So we have some elements here that as sociologists we look at, and that Let me try something, Steph. No? No? Please. Directly through interdiction of the biological and social reproduction of group members sustained regardless of the surrender or the lack of threat offered by the victim. To me, this doesn't help, because there are at least 4 or 5 more that I could have found to dazzle you with, and I can see you're all dazzled. Now, if we apply Porter's typology, and we see the Holocaust as what we call an ideal type. Is there any sociologist out there who would like to define what an ideal type is? And I'll follow it along with you. My notes don't show it. Okay. All right. To eliminate a real or potential threat, to terrorize real or potential enemies, to acquire economic wealth, and to implement a belief in a colonization of the New World. And examples include the Pequots of New England and the Hereros of Southwest Africa. New World, Africa. The Hereros were in a colony that was of Germany in what is now South Africa. A belief, theory, or ideology. Well, this is more recent in origin, and it differs from the first three in that the primary victims are members of the perpetrator state. Well, what's meant by that? Well, they actually live amongst the perpetrators. This is often at great cost to the perpetrators. And examples include the Armenian Holocaust, genocide, the Holocaust, the Cambodian genocide under the regime of Pol Pot, which took place just 30 years ago or so. Steph? Okay. Was just a little bit out of sync there in my notes. Okay, so Jack Newson Porter talks about 4 processes that are directly tied to genocide, and they're very important. The first one is technology. Identify an ideology that we might subscribe to? Capitalism, the free market ideology. Yes? Pax Americana. Would you elaborate for our, excuse me?
The idea that the United States is preordained.
Peace in the world. Thank you. Now, ideology is used to justify and legitimize discriminatory acts against victims. One ideology is anti-Semitism. Hitler laid that out in his this is a very, very important concept. And one that you probably should think of. And the slide doesn't show up all that well, but
It's in the reading.
it's in the reader on one page all by itself. Okay. Well, this one's a little different, but it's still the same thing. Universe of obligation. And what we're talking about, it's important to think about. Just who are we obliged to? Universe of moral obligation is that circle of persons towards whom obligations are owed, to whom the rules apply, and whose injuries call for attention and. Do you think that the Jews were inside that universe of moral obligation during the Holocaust? No. What I ask students to do at this point is to kind of go off on another mental place and think without having to Volunteer it. Who do we put in our universe of moral obligation? O, support. Is it just our family and friends? Does it go out wider than that? To other groups? To just the citizens of the United States? Go on to the third. We're talking about ideology. This is an ideology. Okay, let's talk about bureaucracy. For those of you who have never seen a picture of him, this is Adolf Eichmann. And I consider him the premier bureaucrat. An ideal type. But bureaucracy is usually composed of politicians and political leaders, top-level decision makers, military leaders, clerks, military personnel, guards, and ordinary people. And the people at the top set the policy, and everybody under them in the bureaucracy jumps on board. You know, if you go into financial aid and you say, I didn't get my check yet. Somebody up above, well, you can't have your check. Why not? Well, my boss told me I'm not supposed to hand out. You should know that 800,000 people were murdered in Rwanda in the short space of a month with machetes. Does everybody know what a machete is? It's kind of a long knife. It just goes to show that technology can... the Germans made every Jew wear a yellow star, but that did not happen. Jews were isolated from the rest of society. I need say no more than ghetto. Jews were concentrated in ghettos, concentration camps, taken out of the larger society, and eventually murdered. This is stages of social disintegration, taking people out of society. I would suggest to you that this is something we would look at if we saw something happening and we thought, is this a precursor to a genocide?
Would another form of that not just being stripped of their livelihoods and possessions, stripped of their rights as citizens?
Right. That's what the Nuremberg laws did. Stripped them of their rights as citizens. A very important point. But this was also separating and isolating Jews. Okay, so the other thing that sociologists think about is who were during the Holocaust? What roles did people play? What was the way that we might define their participation? It freezes up when I... Okay, so the social actors during the Holocaust were categorized as perpetrators, victims, someone who sat at a desk and facilitated the deaths of people. I mentioned to one of my sections that there was a documentary that was made called Shoah, which is the word for Holocaust. And one of the people that was interviewed worked for the German railway. People who actually did the killing face to face. Nothing would have taken place if it wasn't for them. But everybody had their part. Compliant killers, the ordinary men, and it was mostly men, who were conscripted and sent to Poland. Then there were the rescuers. We have had the privilege of having Knut Dybe, who is a Danish rescuer, come and speak to us. 2 years ago, he said that was the last time he felt he had the energy. He's quite old. He was named a righteous person by Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem is the authority in Israel that is responsible for, it's a museum that's responsible for remembering the Holocaust. And one of the things that they do is they take testimony from people who were rescued by people. And they name them righteous people, and they plant trees, and they honor them. My own work is in studying Denmark. And Denmark happens to be the only country that was named as a righteous person. It was named as a righteous country because of how widespread the actions in defense of the Jews were. There were righteous people in every country, including a group of, but the country with the most rescuers was also the country that had the most Jews. And which one was that? Poland, right. I read in the paper today that someone died who was a righteous person in what was now Russia, who at the age of 13, OWs, homosexuals, the Roma and the Sinti, communists, political opponents, and countless others. We also know that the first victims, organized group of victims of the Nazis, were who? Who? Communists, organized. Paul? Was the world's lack of response due to collective lies? That's really a very complicated question, but I would say that it would, in addition to there being political influence, that it was also largely due to a kind of ideology that turned people from thinking that it was something important to come into the United States. And that was turned away because they might take jobs from Americans. To say that anti-Semitism was involved, there were very large anti-Semitic movements in the United States. President Roosevelt was very cautious on what he did because they were accusing him of being a Jew lover. So the world's response is very, very complicated. One that might tip us off to it being anti-Semitic was the New York Times has done a study of what was printed in the New York Times during this whole period and where did it appear in the paper. And it is almost ridiculously absent from the front pages and shoved back in Section 2 and Section 3, that these great catastrophes. So, like anything, it's very complicated. You can't ascribe it to one thing or another. Okay, for your reading for this week, you had a reading from Samantha Powers, who wrote the book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide. And it's an analysis not only means it's accessible and the language is not difficult. Her point is that if we remain silent and don't push our government to take action, that our government doesn't take action. Take action, the government has to sit up and listen. And as cynical as it is to say, oh, that's really a bunch of BS, it is happening. We're going to have Jerry Fowler, who is the director of the Committee on Conscience, come and talk with us later in these. And he will talk about the efforts at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum to get the government to act, to get the government to intercede. And that is what the Human Rights Club has been doing for 2 years. Not only raising their voices, but also raising money and doing some important work in Sudan, or important work that goes towards Sudan. That is a picture of some of what's going on. Steph? Are forcing people across the border from Sudan, from the Darfur region, into Chad, largely based on different characteristics of groups, farmers and grazers and military people, Muslims against naming. Their way of life is tremendously threatened. Groups, Survival International, Genocide Watch are all calling alerts. They're asking people not to buy diamonds, because not only does that market fuel what's going on there, but it also is the cause for lots of mistreatment in other parts of Africa. Okay, so let's go over this real quickly. What are sociologists' research interests in genocide? Well, basically it's the third one, that we want to investigate, analyze, and generalize about the social phenomena that are associated with genocide. What are the four motives for people who commit genocide? They see people as a real or imagined threat, or a potential threat. Think about the best example that we have right now that we've studied in the Holocaust. To spread terror among real or imagined enemies. To acquire economic wealth. There is a Holocaust survivor, one of the only people to have escaped from Auschwitz, who says that the Holocaust was the biggest robbery in history. Everybody else talks the most important thing to the Nazis because they did things in the name of ideology that went directly against their economic interests. Trains going places full and coming back empty. Soldiers being used for shoes. They put stitches in them that came out the minute a soldier tried to tromp through the mud. So I would say, the Nazis worked mostly fueled by this motive of ideology. Okay, let's remember the 4 processes that are involved in genocide. Technology, ideology, bureaucracy and organization, and the social disintegration of the victims. And the definition of an ideology is that it is a belief system. Bureaucracy, our infamous Adolf Eichmann. Technology. Had to figure out how to create these factories of death, and was responsible for ferrying lots of people to the boats that took Jews to Sweden. But the thing about Denmark that makes it unique also is a lesson to us, and that is Denmark as a country has been named as a righteous nation because what we consider our definition of what our obligation is. I did leave a part out of this lecture, and that is this whole notion of obedience, because Jim Waller is going to present a very cogent description of the processes attendant to what he calls in his book becoming evil.
Thousands of more UN troops to Darfur, but it's going to take a year for them to get there. And I guess it just kind of speaks to how little we're willing to do when we don't have this capability of quick action, where we're saying, okay, we're going to allow thousands more people to die before we do it.
As Americans, we are very much interested in the response that we need. Genocide, but they still don't do anything. So I consider it a very positive step that over 30 of you signed up for information about the Human Rights Club. And even if you do a small thing like throwing a dollar bill into a collection plate that we're going to send around, or if you send a postcard to the powers that be, all in the Senate and in the House, our representatives. Okay, see you all in section. Thank you. I don't know what's wrong with this thing.